we've seen in the past few decades in mental health?
Absolutely. So science is fundamentally about asking questions and finding tools to answer that. So things that we could do to start going back to thinking, what are the questions that matter now? And what tools and science do we have to answer those questions could really help break a deadlock, shift things. And we've got to try that. And I'm very optimistic.
Reframing our questions, but also understanding just how powerful images can be in regulating our mental health.
I think that's one really exciting piece of the puzzle, and it's only a small drop in the ocean, but it's a really, if you think about the human mind and the human landscape and how little we know about it, these brief fleeting images are just so interesting. And I think they can be a key, because they carry such an emotional impact, they can be one of the many keys we need to unlocking puzzles about emotional distress.
And how my mood, for example, might be changed by this flash of an image of a tiger coming into the studio.
Sorry about that. Have I left you?
No, that's over. Yeah, you've left me. I need to go and play Tetris, I think, now to try and calm myself. Emily Helms, thank you very much for sharing your life scientific.
Thank you, Jim.
Jim Al-Khalili. The programme was produced by Anna Buckley. Now on BBC Radio 4, it's time for 1-to-1.
My name is Gillian Burke. I'm a biologist, a writer and a presenter on BBC Two's Springwatch, where we celebrate the passing of each season as experienced by the natural world. But for the past 2 weeks, I've been exploring a very different world. I've been on a journey through the world of gospel music with various guests. We've talked about the anatomy and the mechanics of the human voice and the very specific qualities that make the gospel sound. We've teased apart rhythms, chord progressions and harmonies that accompany the singing. And all this from my adopted home in Cornwall, where I sing with the Falmouth Community Gospel Choir. Today, I'm heading, albeit remotely, to the home of British Gospel, to London, to have a chat with Karen Gibson, Director of the Kingdom Choir. Karen, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I remember the very first time I saw the Kingdom Choir, which is probably when most people first saw you guys perform, and that was at Harry and Meghan's wedding. Wow, first of all. But before we get into all of that, I'm sure there was life before the wedding. So I just wondered if you would share your journey, sort of how you arrived in that moment in time.
Yeah, it's a pretty long journey, actually. But I grew up in a black Pentecostal church and, of course, surrounded by gospel music. And that's how I informally learned music. I'm also classically trained, so took piano lessons and oboe lessons. But I had all this very rich, very powerful gospel training in the church, and through that, I suppose my sister and I, we lent our formal training to our informal training. We started up a 5-piece, a gospel quintet, wind quintet. So I was on the oboe, there were 3 clarinets, and there was a bassoon. And then we started singing. And then we joined the London-wide choir, called the District 1 Choir, and then I got into conducting, and then I started doing workshops, and then after that the gentleman, he's very well known in the gospel world, his name is Noel Robinson. He was headhunted by BBC Radio 2 to MD a gospel program called The Gospel Train, and he got me in to be the choir conductor, and this program would just go around the black Pentecostal churches and record the services, and that would be the show, and I would be in charge of the choirs. So that's how I came to the notice of Songs of Praise. And then Songs of Praise heard about me, heard about the choirs, and said, we'd like you to come and sing on our program. And it kind of took off from there.
Wow, and the rest is history. I mean, really, it is.
This little light of mine, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, I'm gonna let it shine, this little light of mine, little light of mine.
That journey into music, into performing outside of the context of church and worship is quite familiar, I guess, to many people. And I know that there'll be several household names, big artists that all began in the same way that you did in church. For people who are not familiar with that, I'm just trying to think, who are the big artists that you can think of who followed that route, both sides of the Atlantic?
Yeah. Whitney Houston.
Yep.
Aretha Franklin. Al Green. I mean, it's numberless. The scene over here is not as big as in America, but certainly I would say Beverly Knight is one. Misha Paris is another one. So, yes, that thing where you start in church. I think there's something about church singing, something about that really brings life to the voice. Music, I feel, it transfers across all kind of belief systems, political persuasions, ages. Everybody loves gospel. So, that's why you have artists like Whitney, like Aretha. Mahalia Jackson was one as well, where that sound, that rich sound of gospel really does do something for people.
So would you say that Harry and Meghan's wedding was the moment that the Kingdom Choir was kind of launched onto this massive international stage, never to, retreat again?
Yes, although we'd had wonderful moments before, because we'd done some quite high-profile things before. We've been going since about 1994, around then. So we'd been going for a long while. We did take a break, and then we started up again. But I knew something had changed when we were going to the green room, and we had to have security to escort us because we were being mobbed. That was the first thing that made me think, wow. Something's changed here. So yes, it kind of launched us into another realm, it feels like.
I remember watching, probably along with the 2 other billion people, and I do feel like something changed. I mean, I was here in Falmouth, after the main broadcast had ended, I walked out and there's all the Union Jacks and everything lining the streets, and it was a really joyous day. I sort of felt like there was a moment in history where there was a union, if you like, more than just, this couple. And it was really a proud moment. I feel quite honored actually to be able to speak to you, because I felt so good and so proud of our culture, and just to see that all come together beautifully like that, it was a very special moment. But listening to you, it's clear that your faith is inextricably linked with every aspect of your singing and directing the choir and the music and everything about it. I'm curious to know, is there like any tension between, this deeply held faith and then also performing in some of the more commercial arenas?
That's a really good question, and I think, to be honest, when I was younger in the faith, and the thought around what you do with singing was very different, and singing was just for the church. As you grow older, you begin to understand certain things about faith and about God himself, and that actually the music that we sing is not just for the converted, if you like. It's for everybody. It's for people who are hopeless. It's for people who are lonely. It's for people often that you don't find in the church. And actually even that's untrue, because in the church you have the same people who need joy and who need encouragement. They need to be uplifted. The music is not for us to keep to ourselves. That would be wrong. The music is for the person on the street, the person in the pub, the person in Hollywood Bowl. That's who the music is for. It's meant to touch everybody. And it would be remiss of me to think, well, this is sacred music, it's for the church only. No, it's for outside of those 4 walls. That's exactly where it's for. And people need hope.
Yeah. Some of the artists you mentioned earlier, one of the names was Mahalia Jackson. Mahalia Jackson, for me, is a voice that I associate with the civil rights movement. A song in particular that we sing in our choir, Walk With Me. I sort of have this image of the marches, the civil rights marches in the 60s in America, and that was like a whole different tone almost with the music. It was, I don't know whether you would be able to comment on that. Is there a different quality between, then and now? Sort of, time, and also maybe geography? Is there a different quality to the gospel music sound in America to the British experience, the Black British experience specifically?
The civil rights era was a very specific time, and you had a number of events and movements that came together to create that time. The thing about the music that accompanied the civil rights era is that it was sung by people whose lives were surrounded by music via their faith, via their church. I think what also bears upon that is the fact that the Black Americans at that time were not like the Black British as we are now. So I'm first generation. My mum's from Guyana. She came across in the 60s. I was born in the 60s. That's relatively recent. And so I feel that the Americans who at that time had been living in America, part of America, working the soil in America, building America for many, many years, they saw themselves as Americans. So I feel that there's a cohesion there that really enabled them to come together, to make protests, to march, to come together and say, this is wrong, that is wrong. We are here. We are also American. So I feel that that was a really specific time that enabled them to become galvanized in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. What I often think about sitting in 2022 as someone who spends pretty much all my time now thinking about environmental challenges is, I sort of look at climate activism, I look at the environmental movement, and then I look at the civil rights movement, and I think, wow, entire legislation was changed off the back of these protests. And in my mind, the music fueled the spirit to get through what, those protesters had to endure. And I sometimes wonder, whether the shorthand is climate activism, but ultimately people who want to see positive change, not just for environment, but for people as well. But it doesn't seem to have something going for it. Do you have any sense, sometimes you look at that and think, is there something missing? What could people take from the learnings of the civil rights movement, or even like when South Africa, at the end of apartheid, music again was a really big part of that movement. Do you have any sense, what can music bring, and what are we missing,
Yeah, really good question. And I think to answer it, we actually have to look at the civil rights movement. And I think what was different is that era, they were protesting very, very real life and death situations, things that were immediate. And the thing with the environmental movements is that what has been happening with climate change has been happening over several moments, over several eras, but we are on catch-up. And the thing about climate change is that it's, to the human eye, it's not apparent and it's hard to perceive. It's not that it's not real, but it's just not, it's not obvious. It's not as obvious as somebody being chased down the road and their lives being taken because of the color of their skin. I hear what you're saying about music, because music really does galvanize people. It really does bring people together. And it's not that people have not been singing about it. Back in 1971, Marvin Gaye released the song Mercy, Mercy Me. We actually had the honor of singing that at COP26 last year. And then there's another song that has become a bit of an anthem for the cause, and that's Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World. But these are songs that were written in the 60s and 70s. Where is the music now? In the civil rights movement, if I say to you, we shall overcome, immediately you think of Martin Luther King. Immediately you think of the marching, you think of the civil rights, you think of the issues. We need songs that point to what's happening today. And it's not to say that musicians are not doing anything. There are people who are very heavily invested in the movement. You've got people like Coldplay, you've got Billie Eilish, But I feel that we need to get the population singing.
Music for social change. Thank you so much, Karen. Absolute joy to be able to speak to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
121 was produced in Bristol by Toby Field.
New drama on BBC Radio 4.
Would you have lived your life differently?
What?
If you'd known, as a young man, that you were going to live such an impossibly long time.
Alternative reality.
The world is about to go nuts.
You tell people you know their destiny, but you don't.
Imagine you could live for 2 lifetimes.
So you have it. The gift of long life.
1, 5, 7 years. On Radio 4 and BBC Sounds. Starts on Friday afternoon at 2:15.
Now, among the royals, world leaders and politicians at Westminster Abbey yesterday were 183 key workers and community volunteers who were invited to...
On longwave and DAB digital radio, it's now time for the daily service. With me, Leslie Griffiths. Good morning. The pageantry and the pathos reached their climax yesterday. We've been experiencing a strange mingling of joy and sorrow, a gradual and increasing readiness to replace God Save the Queen with God Save the King, a strong mixture of past, present and future. The nation's hopes are now firmly focused on our new king, for him, as for his mother, and as he's told us repeatedly in the proclamations, the addresses, the statements he's been making across the nation, he's counting a great deal on the faithfulness of Almighty God.